But what we don't think about enough is the impact on the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. And we have a fantastic panel of people here to help explain and talk about this. And then we can have some questions and hopefully we'll get into a good discussion. Our panel consists of Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who is the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and the founder of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. She serves as co-chair as the facilitative working group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform of the UNFCCC. Hindu, my view is you shouldn't be co-chair, you should just be chair, but we'll talk about that separately. Kathy Jetnil Kitchener, who's a poet, climate envoy for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And then Salimul Hook, who's a director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development from Independent University, Bangladesh. So how this is going to work, guys, is I'm going to hand over to each of my panelists in turn so that they can give their initial thoughts on the subject for 5 or 6 minutes each. And then we will go into questions. And though I'm very, very happy to talk all day and ask my own questions, what would be much better is if you, who are participants in this, and I know it's virtual, we really want to make it interactive, if you would put questions in on the chat or Q&A function. I think that would be best. So first of all, we will go to Hindu. Hindu, if you could give some initial thoughts.
Sure, thank you very much, man. It's really a great pleasure to be with you and being with Brother Salimul Haq and my sister, Katie. I think we have a lot of things to share together. So yeah, for the UK peoples, it's so great to see you are organizing the COP26. But of course, you also say maybe your reality is very far from what we are living and experiencing from the climate change impact. Let me share with you quickly what's happening back home first. I am coming from Chad, who is the country in the middle of the Sahel regions. And then when we talk about the climate change, the first thing I think everyone knows, it is how we can keep the degree to 1.5. Yes, but let me tell you, in Chad, we already reached 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we already lost the Paris Agreement goals. When people say we need to reduce the emission to 1.5, I think we lost it for us. It's going to be 2 or 3 degrees more. During the summer, we go until 50 degrees Celsius. I watched the news yesterday. They are saying that in Canada, in some places with the fire, they reached 50 degrees Celsius. There was like 400 people dead. So imagine if it is your daily realities during a months and months, how many people that are dying because of this 1.5 degree Celsius just to increase it. This is how we are living it. And the impact are huge. Firstly, it's impacting our own environment because the example of the Lake Chad, who used to be when my mom was young, 25,000 kilometers squares of the fresh water, just to shrink over one generation, 40 years, 90% of the water just evaporated, remaining 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers square of the water. You have more than 40 million people living and depending from this lake. They do not depend from the end of the month salaries. They depend from the rainfall to grow up them crops. And if there is not enough rain, that means we are facing the food insecurity. That's why when you read the report of the last year, because this year it didn't yet come out on the food insecurity, our country is the #1 in red, because we are facing the food insecurity for the entire peoples. Due to the climate change, rain is not coming enough. And in addition, we get flood, as how it's happening in Bangladesh, that Salimul Haq will tell you. So the floods in the Sahel regions also ending up with the food insecurity, because when all your crops is flooding out, you cannot get your food. And the end of all this, it is the conflict between the communities that fighting over the resources that shrinking, the piece of land or accessing to the piece of water to drink, and people fight each other. And some of them just to leave the place to become a refugee. And Kathy will talk about this. I'm not talking about the international refugee that maybe also yesterday we saw that 300 people was in the board coming from all Bangladesh, all the other countries. I'm not talking about this international refugee because they get a lot of media attention. I'm talking about the internal refugee, that people's moving from one place to another one inside the regions, and that create again more conflict between the communities to fight each other. So imagine just the pictures of the climate change in one country in the middle of the Sahel regions. So why COP? Because COP might keep the momentum to give the voice to those who do not get this media coverage or attention to show how the climate change, it is our reality of today. It is not the future, it is not tomorrow, it is today that we are experiencing it. So COP might give the attention on this in order to build equitable, accessible solutions to those who are impacted. And that's why the discussions of how the COP26 might be focused on adaptation and resilience first might be very important to resolve the climate issues. Might be focused on access to the funding. When we say the climate finance, it is not only talking about the 100 billions that are not reached out, not yet, no. It is how this climate finance can tackle half the solutions to loss and damage, climate adaptation, climate resilience to the peoples who are getting impacted today. And it is not a charity that people are asking, because we are not the one who create the climate change. It is the rights. That's why human right-based approach to this COP must be in the middle of all the decisions. And finally, we all know that with COVID-19, we are hitting more all our economy, and the survival of the peoples become more difficult in addition to the climate change. Of course, we are not also having the access to the vaccine. So, of course, we hear also last month, the G7 that held in UK, where the country is saying we are going to give a sum of the millions of the vaccine. It is not giving the vaccine who is the important. Which kind of vaccine are you giving the people? How they are conserving community who do not have access to the electricity, how they can get access to the fridge to put the vaccine in order to keep all the vaccine in the nice temperature to hit the peoples. Access to energy must be in the heart, because this pandemic, maybe it's the wake-up call for us. It might be another pandemic that comes, because when you hurt the environment, you are hurting your own health. So the access to vaccine for the COP, it is a process. It might be, yes, to participate to this COP, but beyond the COP, it must be a daily reality for the peoples of the planet who can act all together. We do not get two planets, we get only one. So that's my message to the COP, and I hope that we can come up and discuss in deep in each of those questions that are coming up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I don't know about any of the panelists, but forgive my ignorance, I had no idea how 1.5% is already gone. You know, it's already, for some countries like your own, that's in the past. We're heading towards 3 degrees or even worse. So I think that that's a really important and sobering point. Kathy, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here. So yes, as it was mentioned earlier, I'm calling in actually from the Marshall Islands, from Medellin, the capital city. And the Marshall Islands is one of the small island developing states, as mentioned earlier. We are an atoll nation, one of the few atoll nations in the world. And that means that we're only 1 meter above sea level. And so unlike other islands where there are mountains like in Hawaii or in New Zealand, there's really nowhere else to go. We have a completely flat, narrow strip of land. And so we're really vulnerable to the rising sea level. And so for us, climate change is also much like what Hindu had mentioned earlier. It's definitely not, it's not a future issue. It's something that we've been dealing with on a daily, on a regular basis, that we've been confronting for a while now. Whether that was through king tide flooding. So every time there's a high tide during what we call king tide season, all of this water would rush over our land, and it would destroy our crops and destroy homes and displace people. And so that was happening really regularly. Besides that, we have extreme drought on the other side of that, where at one point, just a few years ago, they had to declare a state of emergency because of how severe the drought was. And these are extreme weather conditions that we weren't seeing before. And so the Marshall Islands has taken really like as much of a leadership position as we possibly could in trying to advocate for people around the world to take climate change seriously. I mean, for us also culturally, you know, our culture is tied deeply to land. And so much like indigenous people all around the world, you know, we get our identity from the land. And if we lose that land, then we lose parts of our identity. And we also lose important land tenureship, you know, land ownership that gives us rights and that gives us a sense of power and a sense of ownership. You know, all of that gets lost when we lose our land. And so that's something that we're trying to figure out right now, because for a while, the Marshall Islands was very keen on trying to get people around the world to lower their carbon emissions and to focus on mitigation. Only recently have we come to terms with the fact that the climate crisis has gotten so severe that we can no longer just focus on the rest of the world. We have to start focusing inward. We have to focus on ourselves and our own resilience and making sure we protect ourselves from what's coming. Because for us, it's definitely not a debate of science. It is not a debate of what's gonna, you know, whether we should be taking this seriously. It's how do we protect ourselves now for something that's definitely coming for us. And so what we're working on right now is something called the National Adaptation Plan. And that's helping us develop how do we shore up against, you know, this incoming tide of changes that we're expecting. And so that's looking like, you know, seawalls. Seawalls are, you know, walls that we put up outside of our homes to protect our homes from the ocean. You know, that how do we put up more seawalls? How do we fund more seawalls? How does that impact the current biodiversity of the island? But then there's also really extreme measures we're having to take into consideration. And those extreme measures include building islands possibly, or relocation, in fact, you know, having to relocate to another island to consolidate, or like I said, you know, building islands. But unlike other countries, you know, that I know that there are countries around the world that are currently building their own islands, you know, Maldives is one of them. But we don't have the capacity to do that. You know, as a small island developing state, we rely heavily on grants and aid. And so, you know, how do we fund something that's billions of dollars, and how do we even plan for something like that? Especially when, again, we have this unique cultural tie to land that would take in, you know, an incredible amount of consultation amongst ourselves to figure out how do we transfer that ownership and, you know, all of those cultural knowledge. You know, the thing that's also unique about the Marshall Islands is we do have the U.S. nuclear legacy testing. The U.S. tested over 60 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. And so we've actually experienced displacement already. You know, we've had internal displacement within our islands, which I think was what maybe Hindu was referencing a little bit earlier. Also internal displacement from current king tide levels, king tide flooding. But because we experienced the nuclear testing, we've had islands that were literally eviscerated from the nuclear testing. We've had islands that were lost, that we can no longer return to because they're irradiated. And so that history is actually getting tied into how we plan for climate change. We've already experienced loss of land. And so it's like, how do we plan for that now? So how do we plan for that in the future? So I think it's really important that UK parliamentarians understand, you know, that there's really unique situations happening in every country in which we're trying to understand current issues, past issues, and it's getting all exacerbated by the climate crisis. And it's affecting how we develop as a nation, how we plan for our future. And I think also the other thing to keep in mind too, that's really important for us at this point, is how difficult it is for us to engage at the COP. I think we were just talking story before the panel began about how our borders are closed. Most of the Pacific region's borders have been closed since the COVID crisis. And this is because of the fact that, you know, we have to protect ourselves. It's again, us kind of recognizing the, you know, the urgency of this crisis and protecting ourselves first. And so our borders have been closed for a year now, over a year. We were one of the first countries to close our borders. I haven't left anywhere to go anywhere, flown anywhere. And we're lucky, we're lucky because we haven't had COVID. So huge, right? Huge. But at the same time, it makes it really difficult for us to come and engage at the COP. So this is something that we're trying to advocate for, is how do we get representation at the COP? How do we get support from the UK and from other countries or from any other funding resources to be able to come and represent ourselves at the COP? Because there's going to be important decisions that need to be made at this conference. There's going to be important voices that need to be there. And so how do we ensure that those of us from the least developed countries, those of us from the most vulnerable communities get that representation? Because that's going to be important that our voices are heard. So I think I'll stop there because I think I've talked for a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that the point you made around engaging in COP is a critical one. And the point you made around adaptation is something I want to come back to, because I think that's very important as well. But last but not least, as we like to say, Salim El Hook from Bangladesh. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Beam.
I should have called you Professor, forgive me.
No, that's fine. Call me Salim.
My lack of deference.
We're amongst friends. It's a pleasure to be here with my good friends Hindu and Kathy as well. So don't mind that at all. So I'll share three sets of thoughts with you for your audience's sake. The first one is regarding the timing of the COP. I'm sure everybody here is aware that the COP26 was supposed to be held in Glasgow in November 2020, but it got postponed by an entire year for valid reasons, the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions on travel, etc. But unfortunately, climate change didn't take a year off. We took a year off for holding a COP, but climate change didn't take a year off. And more importantly, climate change actually stepped up its game. And I would argue that the year 2021, the 12 months between November 2020 and November 2021, when we hopefully will end up in Glasgow, despite the many obstacles that we are still going to face, climate change has stepped up a gear. And we have moved into what we in the climate change science call the visible impacts of human-induced climate change, which are now causing loss and damage from climate change all over the world, including, as we just heard, in Chad, in Central Africa, even in North America and Canada and Northwestern US. And certainly here in Bangladesh, in my country, I'll share an example. In May of 2020, we got hit by, excuse me, I have a sore throat. We got hit by a super cyclone Amphan that became a super cyclone while it was in the Bay of Bengal, because the sea surface temperature of the Bay of Bengal was 2.5 degrees more higher than normal. And the severity or the intensity of a cyclone or a hurricane or a typhoon is dependent on the temperature of the sea. While it's over the sea, it gathers energy. And that super cyclone hit first India, West Bengal, Calcutta, and then Bangladesh, and did a lot of damage. Now, interestingly, Bangladesh, I would say, has one of the best cyclone warning systems in the whole world. We were able to warn 3 million people living in coastal Bangladesh. They got the warnings, they went to shelters. We have shelters everywhere, and they survived. The death rate, which in previous decades when we've had super cyclones like this, have killed hundreds of thousands of people. This time, the death rate was a few dozen. And those were people who were fishermen out at sea who didn't get back to land in time. Almost everybody on land made it to a shelter and survived. Now, it's been just over a year since we had that cyclone. And on the 1-year anniversary, my colleagues and a number of reporters, journalists, went to visit the area. And what they found was many tens of thousands of people who survived the cyclone, but have not been able to go home because their homes were destroyed. The land that they were doing agriculture on has been salinized by seawater coming into it. And many of them are still living on embankments near where they used to live. Many have moved to Dhaka city and are living in the slums here. And that is a very good definition or description of loss and damage from climate change. So we have saved their lives, but we weren't able to save their livelihoods. And they have become destitute because of that cyclone. And that's something that we do want to put on the agenda for COP26. It's an issue that the vulnerable countries have been raising for a long time. Unfortunately, it's become extremely politicized. The rich countries don't like talking about loss and damage because they feel it'll open the door for liability and compensation, which are taboo words for them. They even don't allow us to use the words liability and compensation in the UNFCCC. But this is a reality. It's happening, and you can't escape it. So a very, very clear message for the presidency of COP from the vulnerable countries collectively, that loss and damage from climate change has to be a big item on the agenda. And refusal to talk about it will put the success of COP26 in jeopardy, at least from the perspective of vulnerable countries. Now, the final set of remarks I want to share is I see as an opportunity for particularly the COP26 presidency and the people of the UK to engage with the vulnerable countries, because we have a high-level group of countries that has been created about 11 years ago called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. These are 50 of the most vulnerable countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America, who came together and formed this Climate Vulnerable Forum 11 years ago when under the leadership of then President President Nasheed of the Maldives. And that forum has continued ever since then. Every 2 years, it's been taken over by the head of government of one of the vulnerable countries. And in fact, the current chair of the group is the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, my Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, and she will be the head for COP26 as well as COP27. As it happens, her predecessor of the chair of the CVF was President Hilda Hein of the Marshall Islands, who also happens to be Kathy's mother. And so this particular Climate Vulnerable Forum group of countries have been at the forefront of arguing on behalf of the vulnerable countries at a high political level. It's not a negotiating group. They are a political group. And they were the ones that argued for and successfully got the 1.5 degree agreement in the Paris Agreement against very heavy odds, even though we're not on track to meet 1.5, as we just heard from Hindu. But nevertheless, we have agreed that that's going to be our global target. And then nevertheless, and now the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina have decided to also take up the issue of loss and damage. And in the last few weeks, we had a visit here in Bangladesh from Mr. Alok Sharma, the COP26 president designate. He had a meeting with the Prime Minister. He met with the Foreign Minister and a number of other experts in Bangladesh. I had the opportunity to meet him. And this message was given to him very loud and clear. A message from not just the governments of the vulnerable countries, but from the people of the vulnerable countries, that COP26 is a make or break. Either it accepts the reality of climate change, loss and damage, and deals with it as the emergency that it is, or the COPs lose relevance. And COP26, if it doesn't succeed in doing that, will actually be a failure rather than the success that we want it to be. There's still time to make it happen. And I hope that you and your colleagues and others in the UK, citizens of the UK, can get your government to make that happen. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Gosh, there we are. It didn't get more upbeat as the speakers went on. But look, I think it's very important. So I just give a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A in chat. I'm just going to kick off with a question to Kathy about adaptation, which she mentioned. And she mentioned I think she called it the National Adaptation Plan that's in place in the Marshall Islands. I was just wondering if she could give a bit of detail as to what sort of things are within that. I know she mentioned seawalls and others, but it'd be, I think it's instructive and for us to hear a little bit about what does national adaptation look like. So first of all, what does it look like? And secondly, how much are these things costing and who is currently meant to be paying for them? Because there is a school of thought in the UK, and I've heard from some people, by the way, I haven't heard this from Alok Sharma and necessarily the official lines, but I've heard from others, which is maybe what we need to do is put all our money in focusing on adaptation rather than putting the money in very difficult macro things to reduce the temperature because it's already too late. And I just wanted to get a sense as to the practicality of that or not. So Kathy, if you could answer on those points, please.
Yeah, I'll try my best. You know, we are still developing the national, so we're still in the process of developing the national adaptation. So it's made up of a number of different components that includes the sectoral statements. So that means statements that come out of every sector to kind of analyze the ways in which climate change has impacted and could continue to impact their sectors, you know, whether that's through education, through health. So you know, for example, with health, they've had to deal with higher cases of dengue, you know, as a result. And we know that dengue is linked to climate change, mosquito-borne related illnesses. And we had a huge dengue outbreak before COVID that really informed how we responded to COVID. It made us realize we didn't stand a chance to deal with COVID if we ever let it in. So some of it is having to deal with, is made up of sectoral statements where we figure out how it's going to impact across each sector. And so that's working within the national government. And then the other part of it, that's a really key component, is what we call the community consultations, where we're going to be going into the various, not just at the urban centers, but we're going to go to the different outer islands, because I think for those who might not know, within the UK, we are made up of many different atolls. It's not just one main atoll. So every atoll is different and has its own unique needs and its own unique community that's experiencing climate change differently. So it's going to involve community consultations at the village level to talk to people about how is it that you're experiencing climate change? What would you like to see? What are the options you're open to? So it's broaching the subject of, you know, more extreme cases of climate change. You know, what would happen if you had to move? You know, and it's going to take a little bit of a delicate balance of, you know, introducing that conversation. And then it's also relying heavily on whatever science that we have that exists right now. And so an example of that is something we call the Remalak framework, which looks at conservation. And it was a community conservation plan that we developed, where we would have to go into every village and actually collect that kind of information. And so those are all the studies that exist right now. So it's really pooling our resources and looking at what do we have right now and how do we put that all together, and then how do we kind of put in the science that we know about adaptation. And that's the difficult part. There's very limited science on atoll adaptation. There's still very little that we know actually about how atolls are changing specifically. And so that's what, you know, that's been kind of part of the difficult part, is who do we listen to, you know, at the end of the day. That's been, you know, it's getting through all of that science. As far as funding goes, we're working with World Bank to develop the National Adaptation Plan itself. So the plan isn't finished yet. We developed an adaptation communication, and we're actually the first SIDS country, first small island developing state country to submit our adaptation communication. It was basically a collection of what kind of studies we have and what do we know so far as a report to the UNFCCC before the National Adaptation Plan. So it's not done yet, and that's the thing. We have to still conduct that kind of the community consultation. We're heading into that now, into going into the outer islands and actually working with the women, working with the church, the fishermen, working with the vulnerable community, the youth, you know, all of that, and getting all of that feedback, because we're really approaching our NAP as not something that could be developed by a consultant from outside and coming in and just throwing together reports. We're looking at it as a really human rights-based approach of bringing together our community, and that's really important to us, that we make sure that it's not just from top down, but that it you know, we look at every vulnerable community. So it's a all hands on deck type of situation. So, you know, when you said something about asking about, okay, what does it look like? Seawalls and also building islands. Yeah, it does look like that, but it also looks at changing the infrastructure, recognizing where are weak spots and building those up, you know, because if our infrastructure isn't strong enough, then we won't withstand what's coming, you know, the disasters that are coming. So I guess that's a short way. Yeah.
So you mentioned you're working with the World Bank.
Yeah.
What about the financing from the World Bank? How's that going to work?
Well, the World Bank is helping to fund and support the development of the National Adaptation Plan, but not for implementation. And that's really the key area that we're really trying to make sure and highlight is that, yes, it's great to get the support, but implementation is where we really need people to be focused on. Is like, what do we do after we have these plans? You know, right now, it's kind of up to every individual country to develop how they're going to, you know, adapt, right? But what it really comes down to is implementation. And so that's kind of, and you asked earlier what if we should take funding out of mitigation. I don't think so. I don't think that that's, you know, at the end of the day, it's not too late. I don't think that's a great attitude. I don't agree with that attitude that we have to just give up and just focus on adapting. No. I would say we have to kind of do both. You know, we can't put all our eggs in one basket, basically. So it just has to be a way to figure out how do you approach both, and and if anything, right now, most of the funds are going towards mitigation. So we do need more going towards adaptation to some degree. But like, so, you know, Salim just said, you know, there's only so much you can adapt to before there's irreversible loss. So that has to be a part of the conversation. These are all interconnected.
Okay.
So,
okay, Hindu, you mentioned 1.5 degrees. We're already sort of past that. What's your sense, if you just take on that point from Kathy around the balance between adaptation and mitigation? How would you strike that balance, say, over the next 5 to 10 years?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm totally agree with Kathy that we cannot give up because we say, no, it's too late. We saw that from the science, it might be too late if we didn't act from now to 2030. So we still have 9 years. 9 years, it's nothing, but 9 years also you can do so many things. So the question is how we can keep the balance between adaptation and mitigation. And we saw also the General Secretary Colony, Antonio Guterres, say that we need to move from the mitigations always to go to the adaptation half. And half adaptation mean we need the finance, all the finance committee through all the climate mechanism, from the Green Climate Fund to the Adaptation Fund to all the new funding that they are creating to go fund the adaptation at least half or more for those who need it. You know, when we have the national determined contributions, the NDCs. So firstly, the NDCs, it's meaning a plan to get the world to all the net zero, to get the world to the emission reductions. But the developing countries focus their NDCs in adaptation, because we know that for us, we have to mitigate, but what are we have to mitigate is so little. So for us, we need to adapt first. And at the end of the day, the developed countries saw that the NDCs of developing countries, only the one who include the adaptations, but all the NDCs of developed countries have how they can move from the fossil fuel to the renewable energy, how they can have the buildings, the infrastructures, etc. But they didn't plan on adaptations. So this is the balance we are asking for. So for us, our urgent things and our priorities is how we can build a sustainable adaptations. So I give you also the examples, because we are not just like asking, pay the adaptation, we are going to do it. We are also solutions. We are having the solutions, because we didn't wait for anyone. We didn't wait for the science or for any other country to come and build our own adaptations. So how we can get our own system of building the solutions to take it forward. I give you one example. Like in my organizations, we are working on the indigenous people's traditional knowledge, because that's also one of the reasons we have the local communities and indigenous peoples platform under the UNFCCC. So for us, how we can turn it into the realities. And Kathy said, it is not the report who are important for us. It is the action on the ground. So we turn it through the actions. So I work with Burkina Faso, Mali, Benin, Chad, Niger on how they can enhance their national adaptation plans, how they can enhance the national policies on climate change by including the indigenous people's traditional knowledge. And the process was simple. It's having the workshop between the indigenous peoples who are the knowledge holders who do not speak like French, English, or whatever, but who do have their knowledge through their own traditional way, traditional language, because they are expert of their own nature. Put them with the expert on science and expert on climate change and the policy makers from the ministries together. And when they discuss, they get the way, when they wanted to build a sustainable livestock. So traditionally, there is a traditional way of putting it, all this knowledge in order to restore the nature, produce the economy, produce the milk for the food, etc. For the crops, it is the same. In which season they have to plant the crops, if it's going to be a flood or drought, which knowledge they are using. So that helped to build in participatory way the national policies on climate change. So those are the things we are doing, but we are not getting attention to it. We are not getting funding to it. So this is the way to have the half for adaptation, is to fund those kind of initiative, action that can help the community to get adapt immediately.
Okay, thank you. Olivia Hanks in the question, in the Q&A, made a point that came up earlier, and I think it was an interesting one, around loss and damage. This is for Professor Salimul. To the extent that, and I'm just going to read Olivia's question, she works for Quakers in Britain, and they are focusing on loss and damage in their climate work. What does, and I'm going to focus this particularly at Professor Salimul, but if any of the others, Hindu or Kathy, want to come in, do. What does good look like? What does a reasonable expectation of good look like in the loss and damage perspective? And if we don't get that, what do you think the Climate Vulnerable Forum will do? You know, so if things don't improve and the richer countries just don't engage on loss and damage in the way you've described, what happens? What next?
Good question. So let me go a little bit into the weeds on this to explain what good versus not good enough is. We already have some agreements. We have something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. It came up for a discussion at the last COP25 in Madrid in Spain, where there were two demands from the vulnerable countries. One was for a technical arm to provide knowledge, technical assistance on what is loss and damage, how do you deal with it, and a second one for financing loss and damage. These two issues went to the wire in COP25 in Madrid, which, for those of you who were there or remember it, went into overtime. It was supposed to have finished on a Friday evening. It went on all Friday night, all Saturday night, and finished Sunday afternoon, and didn't finish everything. So what it did agree to was to create a technical arm called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. That was good. But then it refused to do anything on finance for loss and damage, and that was bad. So what are we pushing for in COP26? We want the Santiago Network done and dusted, so figure out how it's going to work, what it's going to do. That's a good thing. I know COP26 presidency are working on that, but that's not enough. A technical arm to just give advice is no longer just enough. It has to be much, much more. It has to be taken at a political level by political leaders like Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Biden seriously. And that doesn't require a negotiated agreement between 195 countries, but it does require the big countries like COP26 presidency, UK, Germany, the US, to recognize this is a big issue and to say, yes, we are going to start dealing with it. And one very practical way that they can do that is they can make loss and damage into a standing agenda item at every COP. Interestingly, it isn't. It only comes up every few years when we have to review the Warsaw International Mechanism. It's not actually a standing agenda item for COP26 either. So the vulnerable countries under Bangladesh have asked for that loss and damage become a standing agenda item at every COP starting in COP26. It's for the COP26 presidency now to accept that or not. The secretariat, the UNFCCC secretariat, will put that forward in the draft that they give to the presidency. We shall see whether the presidency accepts that. And another demand that is coming mainly from civil society groups for COP26 presidency to demonstrate their seriousness is to appoint a champion. They've got champions for everything in the COP presidency, a champion for loss and damage, so that there's a focal point with whom we can discuss this issue. At the moment, there's nobody. There's champions for adaptation, there's champions for resilience, there's champions for mitigation, there's champions for finance, but there isn't one for loss and damage. So appoint a loss and damage champion now with whom we can engage, and then make sure that it's a big agenda item in COP26, and then we can discuss what does that mean. But failure to do this we will deem COP26 a failure.
Okay, thank you. A question from Theo Mitchell has come in, and he is, and I know Theo well, he is the head of UK and Europe for climate at CIFF. Could the panelists give their views on what the G20 Venice Climate Summit needs to deliver this week in order to lay the groundwork for a new support finance package to be delivered at COP26? I'm just going to put that one to Kathy, not for everybody. So Kathy, what does this need to look like? And just in particular, and I think this is a very important point in relation to finance, and I say this as a British Conservative MP, there are a lot of competing demands on rich countries' finances right now. It is really important, therefore, that we build up in all the right steps so that no commitment feels too big or too scary, because effectively it's been gradually built up and built up and built up. So just in relation to that, or your broader thoughts about the G20 Venice Climate Summit, what's your sense of it?
Thank you. I don't have too much to say on that. I would say that I definitely think that if they can direct more funding towards adaptation, then I think that's kind of our stance at this moment. But again, if they can support more representation from countries at the COP, then I think that that's a really good place to put their financing as well. I think there's a lot. I can empathize with the fact that there's a lot of competing competing demands on their funding and all of that. But as Hindu said earlier, this isn't charity that we're asking for at the end of the day. It is responsibility, for committing, for emitting, contributing the most to emissions. The Marshall Islands contributes 0.00001% of the world's global emissions, and yet we're going to be the ones hit the hardest. So yeah, I guess that's that's all that I can say to that for now. Is just that I would definitely encourage more financing towards adaptation at this time. Yeah, thank you.
Does anybody
have
any other?
Yes.
Hindu
yes.
first, and then Professor.
Okay, sure. Hindu, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I think, I agree with Kyrie. We wanted to have the finance for adaptation, but G20 is going to be an important place right now, because Italy is going to hold also the preparatory meeting of the Food Summit. They're going to hold the preparatory meeting of the COP26. So they have a lot of responsibility on it. I think the issue of the finance, they must also discuss the debt release, because they are going to discuss about the debt release. So how this one to do not be linked with the climate finance. They cannot use the debt release to say that we release that and then it's going to recompensate the climate finance. So this is the important things that the G20 must discuss on it, and they must make it really separately. Our generation and our communities, they didn't contract any debts. No. We didn't saw only the scholars, and we still, our countries have those debts. And who are going to pay it is going to be like the next generation climate change, climate finance. This is the things I think the G20 need to put separately. When they release the debt release, the debt contacted, it is not going to be also in a charity way, because we just forgive the debts that you have, and then now you work on your own to get your climate finance. So that need to be get really clear. And as they're going to host the COP26 there. So the agenda must be in the tables. As Salim said, the loss and damage, it's also about the finance. You cannot pay for the loss of lives, but loss of the livelihood of the peoples must be planned in addition, new and addition finance for the G20 to think about it and discuss about it. And of course, there is competition on the finance. Why there is competition? Because they still is stealing the lands, they still is stealing all the natural resources of our planet and making themselves rich. It is not the competition that they have to pay for the COVID vaccine, they have to pay for the climate change or whatever. Why they have to pay? Because they know the way that they get them this money. So they must give it back to the land. And this land is held with the peoples. And those peoples are the one we are representing here, Coutries, Slims, and myself. So this is the things they need to discuss on the G20.
Thank you, Hindu. Professor.
Thank you, Beam. So just to add to Hindu and Kathy's interventions, I just want to add another element of framing this issue in the context that I gave earlier of the difference between November 2020 and November 2021. We have now transitioned into a climate changed world. Every year is going to get worse from now. If you think this year is hot, wait till you get next year. If you think that's hot, wait till you get the year after that. We are now in a climate change transformed world, which means that an annual meeting at the end of each year in the COP is no longer a fit for purpose venue for talking about doing something and then forgetting about doing it. It has to be a daily occurrence. Every day is happening, and every day somebody needs to be thinking about doing something about it. And in this context, in the climate finance context, the environment ministers, who are the people who go to the COPs, don't actually control finance. Finance is controlled by finance ministers. So, you know, your finance, Alok Sharma doesn't write the check. Rishi Sunak writes the check. He's the one who has to give the money. He got an opportunity in G7 meeting, he didn't do anything. He has another opportunity in the G20 finance ministers to deliver. This is their job, to deliver. $100 billion a year was promised starting in 2020. We're now halfway through 2021. There's no sign of that money ever appearing. We're nowhere near 100 billion that was supposed to have been given last year, and another 100 billion for this year. So I'm afraid the words of the developed countries are almost meaningless now, unless they actually stump up the money. And the money, it's not that 100 billion is going to solve the climate change crisis. The 100 billion is a question of the good faith or the bad faith of the governments who made that promise. If they make a promise and don't fulfill the promise, that's an issue of bad faith in negotiations, which means we can't trust them on anything else. And that's why COP26 credibility is on the line, whether they can deliver the 100 billion or not.
So on the question of credibility, I'm going to come to a question raised by Abu Bakr Bahaj in the Q&A, and he raises two important points. The first is he believes, and I think it's a very interesting point, that COP should have a focus on those on zero energy, not just net zero, and how will their voice be represented, people on zero energy. And then the second one, and it goes to the same theme rather, which is the question is more local solutions. The sensitivity for locally driven, both culturally and politically, locally driven solutions, rather than solutions being imposed from on high from developed, richer countries in Europe or wherever. That being a very important aspect to retain support and to get the right answers. And what is the panelists' view of the sensitivity around that? At the same time as the panelists also saying that we need the finance from developed countries. And I think you'll all appreciate the slight, the distinctions between those two things. So really, I'm going to go to each of you in turn, and this may well be, because we've got 5 minutes left, the last question. And forgive me, because I know there's been a question on COP26 and what the advantages and disadvantages are of it being online as well, online or in person. So if people want to comment on that as well, that would be useful, because I know it's come up earlier in the hour. So really the question to each of you, and I'm going to start with Hindu, and if we keep it to a couple of minutes each, 2 minutes each, is what is the view with those about people on zero energy and how COP should focus on that? What is the view around locally driven solutions in the context where we're asking for more finance to come from the richer developed world? And if you've got time, what do you think are the advantages possibly of engaging with COP26 in an online way rather than being there physically with a big delegation? My personal view is that I think in-person participation, if possible, is so important, but I may be wrong on that, and I'd be very interested in your view. So on those 3 points, Hindu, you're up first, then Kathy, and then we'll finish with you, Professor. Hindu.
Look, quickly. So in this first point, those who are having zero access to the energy, of course their voice must be here. And I start like my community have zero access to the energy as a nomadic pastoralist communities. And then not because we have zero access to energy that we are not having our views to the COPs. So those people must be there and ask for the right to the access to the clean energy, not just to energy. And we do got a sun. So that's also the issue of how the climate finance must fund a clear and proper access to the energy to the communities in order to tackle all the climate impact in general. So I totally agree with him. And it's directly linked with the second questions, the local solutions. Of course, we have to adapt the solutions to the local spaces that need it. And that's why I give the example of the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples on the weather forecast, on the agricultures, and etc. But of course, we need this funding. We are not asking for the charity again. The funding we are asking for developed countries looks on the Green Climate Fund. They create a criteria for the countries, and still the developing countries do not get the access because they wanted to dictate on, you want to have our money, how you can spend the money. This is the wrong way to tackle climate change. The right way is you give the funding and then the peoples define their own needs to implement it. If you are going to dictate, it is a colonial way to give this funding, and we are not in the colonialism, and we cannot accept that the climate change become another way of the colonialism. So it has to be a reason that peoples drive their own solutions because they get impacted, because developed countries is still all the natural resources to become rich. In the final, quickly, I do not think that the online conference can be helpful. We got the examples on just the last 2 weeks on the SB's meetings of the UNFCCC. Many countries have been left behind because they don't have access to the electricity, they don't have access to the internet, and the online meeting are not adapted to each time zone, and there is no interpretation because it's not going to be only in English. Many countries do not have the first language as English. So they are so complicated way of getting people participate in the equitable way. That's why in-person meeting is so important for the developing nations to come in the COP. And Kathy said, we need to be in person in this COP in order to make our voices hear.
Kathy.
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of echo a lot of that. We're also looking at trying to solarize all of our outer islands. Most of our outer islands have been solarized already. We have a very ambitious energy roadmap, 2020 energy roadmap. But again, I all I have to do is really echo a lot of what Hindu said. We do need the financing for that. And then also in terms of local solutions, you know, this is something that we're looking at. We need more research. We need more studies into what those local solutions can be. But also we need accessible funding. You know, I think that that's actually been a really difficult part of the process, is finding funding that can be accessible, that can allow us to provide self-determination, basically. And as Hindu said, it shouldn't be provided with strings attached. You know, it needs to be given to us to be able to implement ourselves. So I think that that's definitely an issue. It's something that we need to prioritize is local solutions, because we don't want solutions from the outside. We've had that happen so often, and it never pans out and it never works. And then finally, yes, I do agree. We have looked and discussed possible hybrid situations, but at the end of the day, I totally agree with all of you so far. It has to be in person. I struggled with the SB with getting online. We had Wi-Fi drop-ins and outs, and yes, the timing was terrible. And so, especially so, if we go to completely virtual, yes, it's great for carbon emissions, but it leaves the most vulnerable countries out of the conversation. And so that has a bigger, that has far-reaching implications as well. So yeah, I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, you are the last.
Thank you. So on attendance at COP26, I'm one of the few people, I believe, who has been to all 25 COPs that have been held so far.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm looking forward to being at my 26th. I hope I can make it. But I echo the sentiments expressed that people from all over the world may not be able to make it, and that is less than ideal. And that is not a good situation to be in. The online world is still not conducive to decision making. It is conducive for information sharing like we're doing right now, but decision making does require face-to-face discussions. And very often these are behind the scenes discussions rather than the formal negotiations. With regards to the energy situation, I echo the other speakers. The people with the lowest energy use are entitled to get energy, but we should be looking to renewable energy to provide that. Just as an example, Bangladesh has one of the biggest solar home systems in the world. We have 6 million households providing electricity to 20 million poor rural households. It's not a huge amount of electricity, but it's enough for them to get lighting and to use in their homes. And that makes a big difference to their quality of life in a big way. So we certainly need to be thinking of those that are energy deprived in many parts of the world, including ours. Thank you.
That's it, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for joining. I'm aware I've been being told that this discussion is going on Twitter. Keep going. Once this finishes, I'll make sure I take a look at it all, and we'll definitely be pushing out those messages throughout the day so that people's opinions and views on what you've heard is shared to a wider audience. I just want to thank you all so much for coming. I've learned a huge amount, and thankful that I haven't had to go to 25 COPs like you, Professor. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining. It's been a really insightful discussion. There will be more of this in the run-up to COP. Thank you very much, and I hope if you get physical, if you guys can turn up physically, I hope to see you at COP
Indeed.
in November.
Look forward to it. All the best. Bye-bye.